was the third night in January in the year of 1957. The cruel, biting north wind blew the storm into the very teeth of the breaks. Many tin snow flurries filled the air. Then the wind with renewed vigor would sweep them up like a million driving pellets straight into the mountainside, to be caught up again with more snow and hurled on once more, while the barren crags whined dismally as in commiseration for all aboard. Yet in this bleak nothing land, many miles from human habitation, there was warmth and comfort. Inside the dark hulk of David King's mighty airship, there were perfect temperature conditions, which as it should be where a man was framing and actually executing the destiny of the world.
Welcome to Our Nuclear Nightmares, a series examining the literature of the nuclear age. The following program contains material and themes that some listeners may find disturbing. Discretion is advised. Episode 8. On the Trail of 1960. The year is 1950. The People's Republic of China, while still engaged in talks with Tibetan officials, launches a surprise attack across the Jinsha River into Chamdo. The ill-trained and underfunded Tibetan army, which is also riven by disagreements between Khampa and Lhasa Tibetans, is swiftly defeated, and the nation is soon after occupied by the People's Liberation Army. The Yugoslavian government speeds up the forced collectivization of peasant farms, which are still suffering from depredations during the war, and increases food requisitioning, leading to widespread hunger. Farmers from Bosnia to Croatia lead an armed uprising against the government, but this is violently put down and the leaders are executed. President Harry Truman signs NSC 68, a classified policy document that outlines an aggressive stance towards the Soviet Union and any form of political communism. The document marks an escalation of the Cold War with a huge increase in military spending, development, and espionage authorization. Let Out the Beast was written by Leonard Fisher and first published in the United States by Newsstand Library. On the Trail of 1960 begins on the bridge of an advanced airship piloted by David King, a resistance leader who is admired by the public and wanted by the authoritarian world government. He is assisted by Johnny Ross, an enthusiastic mechanic who likes to say gosh unironically. They have maneuvered the airship into position for King to broadcast a speech, which he starts by recounting the war that has ravaged the planet.
About 20 years ago, in the offices of the International Trust, a war was planned. A war that would be global. Nation would be pitted against nation. Men were chosen for leadership. Men who were unscrupulous enough to do the job. Millions of men in each country were to be called to the colors. Millions were to die. This war was to be long and cruel. Women and children were not to be spared. Death among the civilian population would be greater than in the armed forces.
King explains that the capitalists use patriotism as a cover to expand the war while also restricting human rights at home. When a federation of nations appeared and offered the idea of a one-world government which would govern fairly and in peace, the capitalists and the big trusts resorted to nuclear weapons to stop the talks. The attack killed half the population and allowed the capitalists to keep a tight grip on the survivors. King asked for the people to rise up and defeat the capitalists through refusal, for soldiers to go home and to laborers to stop working. He also suggests that on January 10th, people should march on the Capitol and throw out the leaders. Once King finishes, he and Ross quickly evacuate the area, barely ahead of a barrage of bombs the enemy fires at the position of the broadcast. They return to their home base, which is a small valley tucked between mountains the enemy has never discovered. The next morning, King runs into Joan Clifford, who had listened to his broadcast, and asks King for more details about his utopian plans.
Well, Joan, it starts something like this. Revolution by ballot. For the reasons I pointed out in my speech. The establishment of a government of the people instead of a government by monopolistic capitalism. We who favor the plan believe that money as it is today is a direct cause of all evil and greed. We propose to go off the gold standard and print money backed by production.
King explains how currency would change each year, a shift to a predominantly agricultural economy, a change to the patent system, mechanization, and other details. As he finishes, Clifford shouts that he sees enemy planes approaching. King assumes that they are performing reconnaissance and will likely return soon carrying soldiers. King and Clifford hurry down to the settlement where they meet up with Ross. King orders the women and children to take the safe route out of the valley, while he and the others go another way. Despite a close call, they manage to escape the soldiers and proceed down the valley where Ross has the airship on standby. As they fly out, a man asks King for more details about his system for a new world, and King launches into another lecture, this time about land ownership and farming. The airship lands in another settlement in Rocky Creek Falls where they debrief the people on what has happened. King slips away while everyone is preoccupied because he feels uncomfortable. Clifford goes to find him, and after some small talk, she expresses her feelings for him. Later, Clifford talks to Helen, who tells her to be more forward with King and more honest with herself about her feelings. Helen decides to act as a matchmaker by talking to King and telling him to be more honest with Clifford. When January 10th arrives, King and Ross head towards the capital where they radio their allies about the planned march. Everything seems to be going according to plan until King contacts Hennessy, the leader of the capitalists, and discovers he is talking to someone else. King realizes the person is Dawson, an arch-enemy who threatens to blow up the Capitol building if the crowds try to take it. King retorts that it won't stop him, and advises Dawson to leave before things get ugly, advice which Dawson takes. The crowd sees the Capitol building without violence, and when King lands they lift him up on their shoulders, and he gives a speech about the new future that awaits.
He spoke. Dear friends, this is David King speaking from the Capitol. All resistance to our movement has capitulated in the most successful revolution in all history. It was bloodless, unanimous. It was the will of the people. You are free now after years of free slavery, and after the short terrible Atom War, forced slavery. But now you are free, in every sense of the word. For the first time since the dawn of history, machinery will be set up to ensure that freedom for all time.
King stays in the capital for a month to consult with leaders who are arriving from all over the world to help build the new order, but demurs when they ask him to become president. He returns to the valley where there's more romantic time with Clifford, and another lecture on his planned new government, this time with an emphasis on farming and responsible management. This plan goes into action as thousands of people descend into the valley area and begin opening up the mines and preparing the land for farming. There's also a short section about the government melting the ice caps to create more arable land, though it does not give specifics on the process. King and Clifford continue the romance, which finally culminates in a small marriage ceremony that is suddenly interrupted when a missile flies past, which King believes is carrying a nuclear warhead.
They were all on their feet, looking at each other. All remembered well the horrors of atomic warfare. The girls looked terrified. Johnny and Parson Phelps bewildered. Only David remained calm and collected as he did in any and all emergencies. His surefire brain was working with the speed of a trip hammer, and this thinking he did out loud. The rocket was low and still in its climb, he said, indicating its starting point is not far from here. Perhaps 20, maybe 50 miles. A few die-hard capitalists are holed up somewhere. This is their revenge. The rocket is no doubt loaded and probably headed for the Capitol.
King and Ross take the airship up as King believes another missile will be launched. Sure enough, a minute later they spot the second missile, and Ross opens fire with the guns mounted on the airship and manages to destroy it. When they land, they learn that the first missile exploded harmlessly out at sea. They use the airship to follow the trail of the missile back to the source and find a town which Ross suggests they blow up, but King worries they could set off an explosion. They identify a command building and fly close to it without being detected. King runs a special hose from the airship into the building and uses it to pump gas inside, which knocks everyone out. They capture one person still conscious, a woman who tells them that a man named Wesley Harrison is in command and is in a nearby cabin. King sneaks up on the cabin with the hose with the intention of capturing Harrison, but when he returns to the airship to turn on the gas, he is surprised to find Harrison already waiting for him. Harrison gloats that he laid a trap and hints he put prisoners in the cabin and plans to change the gas to a mixture that will kill them. However, King had been suspicious about the setup and had brought back a small hose of gas concealed in his jacket, which knocks out Harrison. King rescues the people in the cabin and finds Harrison only knocked out Ross, but executed the woman who helped them earlier. A few days later, King, Ross, and Clifford take a ride in a newly designed car to a new settlement being built a few miles away. During the trip, King answers questions about the model homes that are being constructed and the general organization of the farms. They take a tour of one of the homes, which features new materials that impress Clifford and the others. When they return to the car, Ross explains he got into an incredibly stupid argument with a stranger while changing a tire, and now there's a fight scheduled between the two of them. From the description, King recognizes the stranger as Bull Barnaby. Helen is afraid for Ross, but King is unconcerned. Everyone goes to the fight, but Barnaby lets Ross off the hook and talks to King instead, agreeing eventually to come to the new paradise. While they talk, King learns enough from Barnaby to realize that the capitalists have more nuclear weapons and are hiding them up north, waiting to strike. King, Ross, and Barnaby take the airship to Castle Peak, where Barnaby had noticed some activity. They land and discover a seemingly empty mine, but when they take a closer look, find a closed-off area.
The next door was harder to open than the first, but under their combined efforts it finally gave way. A grisly sight met their eyes. It was a room full of human skeletons, intact with their clothes still draped upon them, which at the slightest touch would fall into 1,000 pieces, leaving only the bare bones, that would also crumble if handled.
After some investigating, they deduced that the miners, who hadn't been paid in some time, were demanding to take stock in lieu of payment, but that the owner, a man called Hugh Dunn, had the foreman gas them to death. However, before the foreman could leave, a sudden cave-in trapped him, and with no help possible, he chose to kill himself. King theorizes they were digging for uranium. The team searches for clues in what's been left behind as to where Dunn could be hiding, but find nothing. As the year goes on, King becomes a father, and he and Clifford create a quiet domestic life together. This is interrupted one night when a stranger appears at their door who has suffered severe injury to his face and cannot talk, but tries to warn King about an enemy installation he has just escaped from. King, Ross, and Barnaby get into the airship and head to the enemy base, which is hidden inside Castle Mountain. They land, knock out the guards they encounter outside, and use their uniforms to sneak in. As they explore, they see slaves being forced to work and who are beaten if they're not fast enough. King uses knockout gas from the airship to render most of the other guards unconscious, but when they reach the control room, they find Dunn and his goon waiting for them, wearing gas masks.
Dunn stood watching David with a queer, twisted grin. "Okay, King, I'm going to grant you one last favor. I'll let your tongue go long enough for you to watch our first rocket go. It'll blow your valley your wife and child are in tonight into hell. I want to hear you plead and beg, King. I want to hear you try and bargain with me for your wife and little son. Men," he yelled, "roll number 4 up to the launching platform."
King and the others are taken away by the guards to be interrogated, but manage to escape almost immediately and use a control panel to switch off the lights in the facility. There is some back and forth between Dunn and King, each telling the other to surrender. When Dunn unexpectedly agrees, King suspects a trap and the team make their way carefully towards him, knocking out several guards along the way and taking their ray guns. They hear a scream in the distance, and a minute later Barnaby is attacked by a monster that King manages to kill after a hard struggle. They find out later that the monster was created by Dunn to be the perfect mindless working slave. Dunn had released the monster, hoping it would kill King and the others, but in a blind rage the monster killed Dunn first. King, Ross, and Barnaby help release the slaves and put the guards and other officials in chains before heading home. The last few pages of the book describe the community getting built, King and Clifford growing old together, and things improving in the world. In the last scene, Clifford teases King that he is, essentially, King David. On the Trail of 1960 is a novel very much out of time. It is essentially a series of lectures about how utopia could be organized and operated, punctuated by set pieces that echo radio adventure serials which were popular in the 40s. Some of its ideas are shockingly progressive, such as racial equality and intermarriage, which was illegal in most of the United States at the time of publication. The other ideas put forward are an interesting assortment, some original, some adapted from sources such as the platform of the People's Party that emerged in the 1890s, and some from early proposed programs of the National Recovery Agency. These groups and others arose during the crises of capitalism of the 1880s and the 1930s, which convinced many that there were fundamental failures in the system. The suffering and hardship of the Depression, both in the United States and abroad, traumatized a generation and caused people to search for solutions such as the New Deal, but also fascism. This search was particularly evident in those who went off to fight in the Second World War and were unwilling to return to the poverty of the pre-war. Even politicians recognized that veterans would not accept a return to the misery and inequality of the previous decade. One notable response to this demand was in the United Kingdom, with the publication of William Beveridge's report titled Full Employment in a Free Society. The report laid out plans for a comprehensive welfare state, and was so popular that when the Conservative Party led by Winston Churchill tried to sideline it, they were routed in the election of 1945. It was also popular overseas to such a degree that the NBC radio program Words at War, which was sponsored by the U.S. Council on Books in Wartime, devoted an episode to it. Although the New Deal was not as ambitious as the Beveridge Plan, it nevertheless was instrumental in reshaping the civic and economic system and lifting millions out of destitution. However, by the end of the 40s, the New Deal was under concerted attack by corporate interests which wanted to remove regulations and lower their taxes. They began courting sympathetic conservative politicians and intellectuals and funding their own influence campaigns. General Motors published and distributed a condensed pamphlet of Friedrich Hayek's fundamentalist book, The Road to Serfdom. General Electric created a television hour and paid future President Ronald Reagan to give thousands of speeches suggesting the government should be scaled back. These campaigns elicited negative reactions from people who had suffered during the Depression, especially those who had been victims of corporate violence such as at Kohler, the West Coast waterfront strike, and the war in Harlan County. The novel reflects this public animosity towards industrialists. The years of the robber barons were still within living memory for many. A significant segment of American opposition to joining the Second World War stemmed from a distrust of business owners considered war profiteers, perhaps best popularized in Major General Smedley Butler's War is a Racket. Another notable publication was Still Time to Die by Jack Belden, which showed how American and European corporations had sold weapons to the Third Reich right up to the declaration of war, and had suffered no consequences. Worse still, the few German industrialists who had been tried and received jail time, such as at Krupp and IG Farben, were being rehabilitated by the government, who claimed that they were needed for the struggle against the Soviet Union. This distrust had been exacerbated during the war by a series of scandals involving price gouging with defense contracts, as highlighted by a congressional committee led by Harry Truman. There was even widespread suspicion that some companies, such as General Motors and Lockheed Martin, had sought to prolong the fighting. It was this suspicion, along with the devastation of the war, that raised interest in another prominent idea of the novel of creating a one-world government. The idea of a one-world government sounds odd in this day and age, but was something earnestly discussed in the post-war years, and with urgency in the shadow of the atomic bomb. There were many proposals for how a one-world government should function. One of the best known, Wendell Willkie's One World, sold over 2 million copies and extensively detailed how such a government could operate. Another example was Gary Davis, who famously ripped up his American passport at a demonstration at the United Nations and declared himself the first world citizen. The action received wide acclaim, including from people like Albert Einstein and Albert Camus. Meanwhile, the United World Federalists succeeded in getting legislators in North Carolina, Connecticut, New Jersey, Florida, California, and Maine to vote for an Article 5 convention to create a one-world government. There were similar votes on the subject during the 81st Congress. Unfortunately, the hardening of Cold War ideology and the outbreak of the Korean War spelled the end of the movement. The novel presents all these utopian ideas through long speeches by David King. This structure was likely inspired by Edward Bellamy's popular and influential novel Looking Backward, which featured a protagonist who falls into a coma, wakes up 100 years in the future, and explores a socialist paradise that has been built. There were dozens of similar novels published in its wake. Most employed the trope of having the protagonist being transported to the future, or meet a visitor from another world, such as in William Dean Howells' A Traveler from Etruria. On the Trail of 1960 differs in that it describes the utopia being built. The novel also differs from most post-apocalypse stories in that it describes building a new form of society, not merely reconstructing the previous one. Most post-apocalypse stories feature characters lamenting over things they have lost, and expressing a renewed appreciation for the little things they took for granted. At the core level, they are conservative stories. They also rarely have a renewed appreciation for things like vaccines and antibiotics, but instead mention milkshakes and cars, a narrowing of the horizon to a consumer culture. They also ignore that the nature of these societies led to the nuclear holocaust. This issue, if addressed at all, is put down to a failure of individuals rather than any structural cause. Sometime after the 2008 financial crisis, the philosopher Frederick Jameson remarked, quote, "It is easier to imagine an end to the world than an end to capitalism," unquote. Any survey of post-apocalyptic and dystopian novels published in the last several decades bears this out. It's only recently that some authors have made a concerted effort to write books with more radical ideas of how a future society could be built. The post-apocalypse landscape is, if nothing else, an empty space where new worlds can be explored and contrasted against the ruins of the old. Admittedly, On the Trail of 1960 leans heavily on exposition rather than example to explain its ideas, which can be tedious for the reader. The characters are stiff and have nothing in the way of development. The plot frequently stops and starts with sequences that have no impact on the overall story. Some of the ideas for organizing society don't hold up to scrutiny. Yet for all that, it is a novel to be commended for saying that another world is possible. If you found this episode interesting, entertaining, or a useful sleeping aid, please consider subscribing to the Patreon. This series is only possible through listener support. You can also help by leaving a review on iTunes or Spotify.